Hello everyone, and welcome back to Soft Stories, where today we are continuing our reading of Silas Kitto Hocking's Real Grit. We finished chapter 1 last time, as well as having a bit of an introduction to my experience in finding this lovely book. And we learned a little bit about the main character, whose name I unfortunately mixed up with that of the main character in Oscar Wilde's excellent play, The Importance of Being Earnest. But in Real Grit, we are following the adventures or misadventures, as I suppose we will see, of Jack Formby. And hopefully I will get better at remembering that name as we go on, because it's rather integral to the story. So last time we finished chapter 1 and we discovered that Jack is a little bit of a wastrel. He doesn't work, he doesn't have outside interests, he simply lazes around all day. The best we can say for him is that he's not actively harming anyone. He's not going around and kicking puppies or drinking all day or smoking up the house. He just lazes around and does nothing. Not exactly the bright future that his father had laid out for him, although perhaps Robert Formby, his father, did have some part in producing a son like this. So that is Jack Formby. A little bit useless, but good-hearted, perhaps. Let's see where the story goes. In chapter 2, A Chance Meeting. Neither Jack Formby nor his father soon fell asleep that night. Both kept pondering over the conversation that had passed between them, and both were dissatisfied with the result. If Jack would only break through that hard, cruel indifference, I would not mind, was Mr. Formby's reflection. I can't, and I won't, believe that the lad has no ability. All he needs is stirring up. The fire is smouldering, and needs the torch of some great passion, some strong love, or some lofty ambition, to kindle it into a growing flame. But then, alas, he seems utterly passionless, and destitute of all ambition. To this conclusion Mr. Formby's reflections always tended, and had he been able to read his son's thoughts at that moment, he would only have been strengthened in the conclusion to which he had come. So the dad thinks I'm stupid, Jack said to himself again and again as he rolled himself from side to side and courted sleep in vain. Well, I suppose I am, though it ain't pleasant to be told so for all that. But then what's a fellow to do? I'm not fit for business, and what people call pleasure is to me a bore. And to worry one's life out for the sake of enjoyment is a very poor philosophy, according to my notion. Really, I don't see why the governor should grumble. He always said I was to do nothing, and I keep working at it like a niggard. And Jack laughed softly to himself, but there was no joy in his laughter, and a moment later his brow was furrowed again with painful thoughts. When Jack got down to breakfast, he found that his father had preceded him by at least 2 hours, so that he was obliged to take his meal alone. He did not object to that particularly. It saved him the bother of talking to anybody. Moreover, he could take his own time over the repast, for he hated to be worried. On his plate, he found a brief note from his father. It ran as follows. Dear Jack, will you run across to Netherby's sometime during the day and have a look at that mare he has for sale? I have had some thoughts of buying her, but would like your opinion first, as I know you are a fair judge of horseflesh. Your affectionate father, R.F. Oh, bother the... was Jack's first exclamation, but he suddenly checked himself, and proceeded to attack his breakfast with more than usual vigour. He paused, at length, and took a second look at the note. Really, he said to himself, I ought to oblige the putter if it's in my power. I shall be getting selfish as well as idle if I go on at this rate. The day was beautifully fine, and when Jack got out into the sunshine, he felt his spirits instantly revive. All the long stretch of valley below him lay steeped in a golden haze. The farther uplands, dotted with fair mansions and extensive plantations, seemed to bask in the amber light, while beyond the plantations and the meadowland stretched the purple moors, which looked dark and almost desolate under the pale sky. The time was harvest, and no sound of reapers broke the stillness, for this was not a corn-growing district. Farmers found it pay better to keep what they call the green side up, for the great city of Bodelford was not 20 miles away, and milk and butter found a ready sale and commanded an excellent price. The river Bodel, broad and for the most part shallow, meandered pleasantly through the valley below, and made dreamy music in the stilly eventide, and filled the silence of the night with its low-toned song. Jack stood for some minutes in front of his home, admiring the scenery. A fellow ought to be happy here, he said at length. Rycroft is beautiful for situation, and full of every comfort and luxury. And what can be more bewitching than this scene? How the Bodel flashes where its ripples catch the light. How green the meadows that fringe its pebbly shore. How cool the plantations look on the farther hillside. How peaceful the homesteads among the trees. What is it, I wonder, that makes me restless, discontented, and ill at ease? He did not wait to answer the question, but started off at a swinging pace along the winding carriage drive, with a cheery "Good morning" to Blake, the gardener. He passed out through the lodge gates into the turnpike road. For a quarter of a mile he went carelessly on at the same swinging pace, then leaped lightly over a stile, remarking as he did so, "I'll take the river path. It may be a bit longer, but it is infinitely more pleasant, and the shade of the trees will be grateful in this bright sunshine. For half a mile he sauntered along the river's bank in a very leisurely manner, keeping his eyes fixed for the most part upon the shining water, then suddenly paused at the stepping stones, while an expression partly of astonishment, partly of amusement, swept across his face. In the middle of the river, where the water was deepest and was rushing with the swiftness of an arrow, stood a young lady on one of the stepping stones, evidently afraid of moving either backward or forward. Her left hand she pressed tightly over her eyes, while her right hand was stretched out as though to balance herself. Jack took in the situation in a moment. The swiftly rushing water had turned her giddy, and now, with eyes closed, she was trying to recover herself. Once she took her hand from her eyes and made as though she would leap to the next stone, but instantly she thought better of it, and steadied herself once more in her old position. The longer she stays, the giddier she will be, was Jack's reflection. So I suppose I will have to help her across. He did not seem, however, to at all relish the situation. His dislike of girls and his great objection to taking trouble made the task anything but an agreeable one. To make matters worse, he saw that the young lady was a stranger, and he was always shy of people he had not previously met. "I wish I'd gone the other," he muttered to himself, but did not finish the sentence. Perhaps he thought better of it, for he darted forward instantly, and stepping lightly from stone to stone, was soon by the stranger's side. "The rushing water has made you giddy, I think," he said in his gentlest tones. "Will you allow me to help you across?" "You're very kind," she answered, taking her hand from her eyes and placing it in his. "I shall be so much obliged if you will." But for a moment Jack seemed both drunk and motionless. Such a face he had never seen before. So fair, so sweet, so gentle, while her voice sounded almost like music in his ears. She was dressed in black. He had not noticed that until now, but this, coupled with her timidity, accounted for the extreme paleness in her face. "You're a little frightened," he said at length, holding her hand tightly in his. "But trust yourself to me, and step out boldly. The next is rather a wide gap, and the current is swift, but you can easily do it. There. Now the next." And so, from stone to stone, they tripped lightly, till safe on the river's bank. He let go her hand then, and waited a moment for her to speak. "What a lissom, dainty, graceful little creature she is," was the thought that passed through his mind. Then the clear brown eyes looked him full in the face, while the red lips parted, showing 2 rows of pearly white teeth. "I thank you very much," were the words that fell upon his ears, and in some unaccountable manner set his heart throbbing wildly. It was very foolish of me to lose my head in that way, but I am not used to crossing rivers by fording stones. I shall not give in, however. I don't like to be beaten, do you? And I shall return this way again. Well, I don't know about that, Jack answered dubiously, for this little speech had nearly taken his breath away, and the question was so abrupt and searching. Don't know about what? She asked, a little bit shyly. About being beaten, he answered slowly. I'm afraid. I would rather be beaten than take much trouble over a thing. Oh no, surely you don't mean it. You are only joking, she said with a little laugh, while the colour mounted to her pale cheeks. But you don't know me, he said, in tones that sounded half regretful. No, but you're very kind, and I am very thankful to you. And with a graceful inclination of the head, she moved quickly along the river path. Jack stood, watching her, until she was nearly out of sight. By Jove, he muttered, if she ain't the loveliest creature I ever saw in my life. I wonder who she is, and where she came from, and where she lives. I'm glad I came this way after all. I wouldn't have missed this little adventure for a fortune. And with this reflection, he turned on his heel and went bounding across the river, and then boldly faced the hill on the opposite side. 20 minutes' brisk walking brought him to the gates of Netherby Hall, and 5 minutes later he was discussing, with more than usual animation, the points of the bay mare with Dick Netherby and the squire. Now, Formby, said young Netherby, when Jack had examined the mare to his satisfaction, you will stay and have lunch with us as a matter of course. We see so little of you that when you do put in an appearance, we are not disposed to let you go in a hurry. Thanks, said Jack, with a drawl. It's very kind of you, I'm sure, but you must excuse me today. You really must. To tell you the truth, I've only just had breakfast. And what of that? Said Dick. We shan't lunch for another hour, and in the meantime we can have a canter, say to Whetstone and back. Really, I should enjoy it very much, said Jack, pulling a wry face at the fib, but I cannot possibly stay today. I really cannot. You must be an amazingly busy fellow, said Netherby with a laugh. However, if you can't stay, I won't press you further. But will you promise for Saturday afternoon? We're having a small tennis party, and I was just about to send you an invite when you called. Well, thanks, said Jack, with a drawl. I'll promise to come, though I can't promise to play. You know I'm an awful duffer at those things. You should practice oftener, said Netherby. Now, your cousin, or whatever he is, Ralph Formby, is quite a crack player. Is he coming on Saturday? Oh, yes. Our Kate thinks he is indispensable. And really, he is a downright good fellow. Don't you think so? The governor thinks a world of him. He's splendid company, Jack remarked, sententiously. Splendid, echoed Dick. Though, by the by, Formby, what's the relation between you? Our grandfathers were brothers, said Jack, so I suppose we shall be called second cousins."
"Oh, just so, precisely," Dick answered. "I always lose myself when I get beyond first cousins. But to come back to the tennis, you will be here on Saturday, without fail?"
"You may depend on me," Jack answered, and with a hasty "good morning," he was gone. He felt a little ashamed of himself as he hurried along the dusty highway. He might have stayed to lunch, and ought to have done so. Moreover, he would have done so, but for the chance meeting of the morning. He hardly liked to confess it to himself, but the truth must be told. He was all impatience to see the sweet face and the dainty, graceful figure that had so captivated his imagination an hour ago. She had told him that she would return by the same way, for she did not believe in being beaten, and he might have the pleasure of seeing her cross, or better still, of lending her a hand. In this, however, he was doomed to disappointment. In turning a corner, 500 yards before he reached the river, he met her, face to face. She had crossed without his help, and now, with flushed cheeks and parted lips, was hurrying quickly up the hillside. She smiled at him as she passed, which he acknowledged by raising his hat, and when he turned to look at her, she had turned the corner and was out of sight. Slowly, and with listless steps, he pursued the rest of his journey home, and during the greater part of the afternoon he sat out under the veranda in front of the house, musing over the events of the morning. He was sorely puzzled at himself. He had always so cordially disliked the gentler sex that he was quite unable to account for his present interest in this strange young lady. Perhaps it was because she was a stranger that he felt so interested. And yet, why should that influence him? Strangers were coming and going, and fresh faces were to be seen any day in the neighbourhood, and never before had he cared who came or who went away. "I'm a great simpleton," he said to himself at length, "to worry myself over a girl's face. I'll get a book and think no more about it." And, suiting action to the word, he rose from his seat and sauntered off into the library. And half an hour later the butler found him, fast asleep, in a rocking chair. Chapter 3. The Tennis Party. During the next 2 days, Jack took more walking exercise than he had done during the previous 2 months. Each morning he was downstairs in sufficient time to take breakfast with his father, much to that gentleman's satisfaction, who began to flatter himself that the conversation he had had with his son was already beginning to bear fruit. He gave no hint of this, however, nor did he make any remark on Jack's early rising, or manifest the least surprise when Jack proposed to accompany him to the station. The weather continued delightfully fine, with just sufficient breeze to keep the air sweet and cool, while the country looked its best, especially in the sweet, dewy morning, when the hedgerows hung with little globes of light, and the trees and fields seemed swept with a richer green. The walk to the station and back did Jack good in every way. He felt brighter, happier and healthier for the exercise, and, as a consequence, was disposed to take a more cheerful view of life and the world generally. He did not return to the house by the way he had come. He felt in no hurry to get back to Rycroft. A little longer walk, he argued, would do him good, and the path along the river's bank was always a pleasant one, but especially so on a summer's morning. It was surprising how interesting this walk had suddenly become, for he returned to it again after lunch, and spent a good part of the afternoon within view of the stepping stones. And when he turned his steps homewards, it was with a slow and measured tread, as though he felt loth to leave a spot so fair. He did not like admitting, even to himself, that it was the hope of meeting the chance acquaintance of the previous day that had lured him thither. Put into plain English, it seemed such unheard-of folly that he did not like to own to himself that he was capable of it. Yet, on the following morning, he returned from the station by the same route, and even extended his rambles across the stepping stones, and for many a mile along the countryside, and returned to a late lunch tired, hungry, and disappointed. "I'm pretty much of a noodle," he said to himself an hour or so later, as he sat under the veranda puffing leisurely at a choice cigar, and with his eyes fixed on the valley below. It was a warm, quiet afternoon, with scarcely a sound to break the stillness of the countryside, while a thin haze hung over the valley from end to end, and crept softly up the hillsides, and vanished on the fringe of the purple moors. "Anyhow, I wish I knew who she was," he went on, taking a cigar from his mouth and knocking the ashes off with his second finger. "It's tantalizing to be foiled in this way, to say the least of it." He knew that he could easily find out who she was, if he could only summon sufficient courage to make inquiries amongst the neighbours. But that he could not bring himself to do. What business of it was his? Moreover, he knew he would get chaffed unmercifully, were he even to attempt it. So he watched and waited, hoping that some good fairy would come to his rescue sooner or later and satisfy his curiosity. But when Saturday afternoon came, and his hope seemed as far as ever from being realized, he grew sullen and cross, and was on the point of sending a note to Dick Weatherby, excusing himself from attending the tennis party, and would have done so but for the interposition of his father, who always returned from business at noon on Saturday, and who would not hear of him excusing himself. "It's all nonsense," he said, in answer to some petulant remark of his son's. "You don't get amongst your friends half enough. Come, don your flannels, and I will walk across with you and complete the purchase of the mare." "I'd much rather stay at home," said Jack with a frown. "Very likely you would," said his father, "but we must not always follow our likes. We have duties to others as well as to ourselves." "But I'm such a duffer at tennis," Jack interposed. "All the more reason you should practice it," was the answer. He was on the point of saying, "I don't want to be bothered," but thought better of it, and, without another word, went to his room to get ready. At the gate of Netherby Hall, father and son separated. The one going to the stables, the other to the tennis lawn. Jack felt ashamed to put in an appearance, for he was nearly an hour behind time, and was very much afraid his absence had inconvenienced the other players. On coming upon the scene, however, he was both pleased and piqued to discover that he was not at all missed, for 2 sets had been made up, and the game was in full swing. Crossing to a garden chair, he took a seat with as little ado as possible, and began in his own deliberate manner to take stock of the guests. Slowly, his gaze travelled from one fair face to another. Then, with a sudden start, he half rose from his chair, while the hot blood rushed suddenly to his neck and face. "By Jove, it's her," he said, half aloud, "and more beautiful than ever. Now I shall know who she is and where she comes from." She had not noticed him yet. She was too interested in the game. Would she recognize him, he wondered, when she did see him? He should feel awfully disappointed if she did not. From the moment he caught sight of his unknown acquaintance, he had no eyes for any other member of the party. He became interested in the game, too. How well she played! How easily she caught up the balls and sent them spinning over the net! How graceful was her every movement! How fresh the colour of her cheeks! He hoped she would be on the winning side. The game was a closely contested one, and all the players were getting excited. Jack fairly held his breath, so anxious was he that the fair stranger should win. "Well planted!" he shouted in his excitement, but no one heeded him. "Vantage home!" cried Dick Netherby a moment later. Then a long minute of intense excitement, and up went the stranger's racket, while Dick shouted, "Game!"
"5 games all. This is close work,"
said Ralph Formby from the other side of the net.
"Now for the final tug-of-war."
"It's your serve, Kate,"
called Dick, who was playing against his sister. Then, turning to the stranger, he said,
"Now, Ada, do your best. This game completes the set."
She answered him only with a smile, which Jack felt he would give a fortune for, then stepped quickly back, caught up the ball that Kate had served, and sent it spinning over the net. Back it came again into her court, and was quickly returned, but this time with such a twist on it that it fell like a lump of dough, and gave her opponent no chance of returning it.
"Well done, our side," shouted Dick.
Then in a lower tone he added,
"Ada, you're doing splendidly."
A pleased smile overspread her face, but she did not answer, and the next moment the play was in his hands. He did not do so well, however, and 15 all was called. The next ball was served to Ada and missed, at which Ralph Formby bawled out exultingly,
30-15,
while Jack felt that he would very much like to punch his cousin's head, and actually clenched his fists when he shouted out a minute later,
40-15.
"I'm afraid she'll lose," muttered Jack to himself. "I shall be sorry if she does. She deserves to win. She plays so well." But now the tide of fortune has turned again, and 40-30 and deuce are called in quick succession. "By Jove, there's a chance for her yet," mutters Jack with clenched teeth. "Now for it, fair stranger." But the tide goes against her once more, while Ralph Formby calls out,
"Vantage home."
This is responded to a moment later by Dick Netherby calling, "Vantage all," and each member of the party draws a long breath. "The last service is to you, Ada. Do your best," whispers Dick. "I'll try," she answers with a clean smile, and the next moment she cleverly returns the ball. In a moment it is spinning towards her again, but she is quite prepared for it, and drops it nicely, just over the net. Ralph Formby is there, however, to pick it up, and back it comes a third time, to be returned by Dick Netherby. "Well done!" cries Jack in his excitement, but Kate is in her place to return it. "Quick, Ada!" calls Dick in his excitement. The next moment he flings his straw hat into the air. Ada's last stroke had won the game. Jack felt triumphant, though why he should do so he hardly knew. He had never been an enthusiast at tennis, or, indeed, at any other game, and why he should get excited in the present instance was a puzzle, even to himself. But he had no time to reason about the matter, even if he had the inclination, for Dick Netherby was rating him for being late, as usual, while the others were standing near, waiting to speak. He could never remember afterwards whether he spoke to his cousin and Miss Netherby or not, but he always carried with him a distinct recollection of being introduced to Miss Ada Woodville. She came forward, with a frank smile lightening up her lovely face. "We've met before, Mr. Formby, I think." And he answered, "Once before, Miss Woodville." And then, somehow, it seemed as if they had known each other for years, and in a few minutes they were engaged in quite an animated conversation. Then the other guests, who had been strolling through the grounds, came up, and new sides were demanded for a fresh game of tennis. To his infinite delight, Jack found that he had secured Miss Woodville as a partner, and that they were to play against Netherby and a Miss Cox of Bodelford, a young lady of uncertain age.
"I hope you can play a losing game, Miss Woodville,"
Jack said to his companion, as they were taking up their positions. "Why, Mr. Formby?"
"Because I am always on the losing side," he answered with a laugh.
"How unfortunate," she said, smiling back at him. "But you should be more careful in the choice of a partner."
"It isn't that my partners play badly," said Jack. "Indeed, I'm generally allowed to select a good player to make up for my own deficiency, for, really, Miss Woodville, I am a wretchedly poor player."
"I'm sorry to hear that," she said, "for in truth, I don't like to be beaten."
"So I have heard you say before,"
he answered with a smile. "Heard me say so before?" she said, looking at him incredulously.
"Yes," he answered. "Don't you remember?"
"No," she said, looking puzzled. "I do not. When was it, or under what circumstances?"
"You remember our first meeting?" he said. 3 days ago?"
"Oh, very well," she answered, with a smile and a blush.
"And don't you remember, when you were on the farther side of the river, you said that you would return by the same way, as you did not like to be beaten?"
"Did I say that?" she answered naively.
"You did," said Jack sententiously. "And it appears you succeeded also."
"Oh, yes," she answered. "I saw you coming before I reached the fording stones, and so I made a rush for it, and never paused a moment till I was safe over.
But you might have fallen in, said Jack. In which case you would have had the trouble of fishing me out, she answered defiantly. I should have enjoyed that immensely, said Jack with a good-humoured laugh. For shame, she said. I did not think you were capable of such an unkind remark. And with a pretended frown, she rushed off to the corner of the court, for it was her first serve, and their opponents were getting impatient to begin the game. It need scarcely be said that Jack was on the losing side, as usual, though he played better than he was ever known to before, while he threw an amount of enthusiasm into the game that was altogether unusual for him. For almost the first time in his life, playing was not a bore, while the afternoon, instead of being slow, passed all too quickly. Regretfully, he watched the shadows deepening over the hills, and reluctantly he left the lawn, when it became too dark to play, to go indoors. The invitation to stay to dinner he accepted with alacrity, and a servant was promptly dispatched to Rycroft for his dress suit. The Netherbys, as well as his father, wondered at his unusual gaiety, though none of them had the slightest suspicion of the cause, nor did they appear to notice the change. As for Jack, he was simply conscious of an unusual flow of spirits, and a cheerfulness and light-heartedness that, of late, to say the least, had not been usual with him. What its meaning might be he did not take the trouble to interpret. That the presence of Ada Woodville was in some way associated with the change, he did not deny, but he had no wish to probe the question to any depth. For once he was happy. He had somehow got out of the gloom into the sunshine, and he was disposed to make the most of it, without asking any questions. He had a vague feeling that if he began to inquire into the matter, it might spoil the pleasure. It might be like a child opening its drum to see where the sound came from, and he was determined not to do anything so foolish. He would just sit still and enjoy the music and the beauty and the sunshine while they lasted. And if they came to an end, which he supposed they would sometime, he would be just where he was before. No worse, surely, perhaps a little better. The memory of such a time would always be sweet, and so he resolved that he would make the most of his opportunity. And that, I think, is where we will leave it for today. I will place my University of Leicester bookmark into this book, this story of the improvement of Jack and the introduction of Miss Ada Woodville will lead us into the next episode, in which we will cover chapters 4 and 5 of Real Grit by Silas Hocking. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. All the best, and goodbye.